Hair color seems simple enough. Brown, blonde, red, black inherited traits passed down through generations, determined by genes we've understood for decades. That's the story we've been told. But when scientists at the Francis Crick Institute in London extracted ancient DNA from Bronze Age skeletons buried across Britain, the genetic markers revealed something no textbook predicted. Hair color wasn't just inherited. It was a map, a biological record of populations that arrived, mixed, and vanished, leaving behind only their genes in the bodies of people who never knew where those traits came from. Dr. Ian Barnes, a paleogeneticist who led the 2021 study, described the findings in a way that made his colleagues pause. The distribution of hair color genes across ancient Britain didn't match what migration records suggested. Blonde hair appeared in populations that should have had dark hair. Red hair showed up in regions where it had no ancestral origin. And the genetic markers responsible for these traits trace back to populations that official history claims never reached the British Isles. The research team analyzed DNA from 793 ancient individuals, spanning 12,000 years of British history. They weren't looking for hair color specifically. They were mapping population movement, tracking how different groups migrated, settled, and mixed over millennia. But buried in the genetic data was a pattern no one anticipated. Specific hair color genes appeared in clusters, concentrated in regions where they shouldn't exist, carried by people whose ancestry records showed no connection to the populations that originated those traits. Here's where it gets strange. The gene responsible for red hair, McConnor, is often associated with populations from the Eurasian steppe, particularly groups that migrated westward during the Bronze Age. But the ancient British samples showed minor variants in individuals whose broader genetic profile indicated they descended from Western European hunter-gatherers, people who had no documented contact with steppe populations. The genes were there, the migration pathway wasn't. Dr. Barnes submitted a detailed report to the journal Nature, outlining the hair color distribution and its implications for understanding ancient migration. The report included maps showing where each variant appeared, statistical analysis of gene frequency, and comparisons to modern populations. But when the study was published, the section on hair color ancestry was condensed to a single paragraph. The maps were removed. The migration contradiction was mentioned briefly, then dismissed as requiring further investigation. One researcher involved in the project, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described what happened during the peer review process. Reviewers questioned whether the hair color data should be included at all, not because it was inaccurate, but because it raised questions about migration timelines that contradicted established models. The suggestion was made to focus on broader population genetics and leave the hair color findings for a separate future study. That study has never been published. The data itself is undeniable. Ancient Britons with blonde hair carried genetic markers from Scandinavian populations, but their broader DNA showed they lived in Britain 1,500 years before any known Scandinavian migration. Individuals with dark hair in southern England had gene variants typically found in Iberian populations, yet their remains predated the Roman occupation by centuries. The physical traits were real. The ancestry was documented. The timeline didn't fit. Dr. Johan Diekman, a computational biologist at University College London, analyzed the same dataset independently. He focused specifically on the melanocortin-1 receptor gene, which controls pigmentation. His findings matched the original study. Hair color genes in ancient Britain showed a distribution pattern consistent with multiple unrecorded population migrations. Groups arrived, left their genetic signature in hair color, and then either left or were absorbed so completely that no archaeological evidence of their presence survived beyond DNA. What makes this especially difficult to dismiss is the precision of the genetic evidence. Modern DNA sequencing can identify not just the presence of a gene, but when it entered a population. The blonde hair gene variants in ancient Britain show a molecular clock signature indicating they arrived approximately 4,500 years ago, during the early Bronze Age. But the archaeological record for that period shows no evidence of migration from regions where those variants originated. No trade routes, no burial goods, no cultural markers. Just the genes. Think about what that means. Entire populations moved through Britain, stayed long enough to interbreed with local groups, and then vanished without leaving a single piece of pottery, a single burial site, a single carved stone. The only proof they existed is in the hair color of people who came after them. There's another layer to this. The distribution of hair color genes across ancient Britain isn't random. It follows geographic patterns that suggest deliberate settlement. Blonde hair genes cluster in eastern coastal regions, the exact areas where Scandinavian migrations would later be documented during the Viking Age. Red hair genes appear predominantly in Scotland and Ireland, regions associated with Celtic populations. But these patterns existed 2,000 years before the Celts arrived, and 3,000 years before the Vikings. Dr. David Reich, a geneticist at Harvard Medical School, who has studied ancient European DNA extensively, published a paper in 2018 examining similar patterns across continental Europe. His findings showed that hair color genes spread faster than cultural markers, moving through populations via intermarriage long before large-scale migrations occurred. He described it as ghost ancestry, genetic evidence of people who left no other traces. When asked about the British data specifically, Reich acknowledged that the timeline discrepancies were significant. In an interview with Science magazine, he stated, "We have genetic evidence of population mixing that doesn't correspond to any known migration event. Either our understanding of Bronze Age movement is incomplete, or people were traveling much farther and more frequently than we've assumed." The British Museum houses skeletal remains from the Bronze Age site at Amesbury, just a few miles from Stonehenge. In 2019, researchers extracted DNA from a woman buried there approximately 4,000 years ago. Her remains were found in a simple grave, no elaborate burial goods, nothing to indicate she was anyone special. But her DNA told a different story. She had blonde hair. Her genetic markers showed ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, a region over 2,500 kilometers east of Britain. Her broader genome, however, was 85 Western European hunter-gatherer. She was local, but her hair color came from somewhere else. The museum requested permission to publish the findings as part of a larger exhibition on Bronze Age Britain. The request was denied by the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, the government body that oversees national heritage sites. The reason given was that the findings required additional peer review before public presentation. That review was never completed. The woman's remains are still in storage. Her DNA results were archived. Here's what we know for certain. Ancient DNA doesn't lie. It can be misinterpreted, but the genetic sequences themselves are objective records. The hair color genes found in ancient Britain are real. The populations they trace back to are documented. The problem is the timeline. If those genes entered Britain when the molecular evidence suggests, then people were moving across Europe in the Bronze Age at a scale and frequency that official history doesn't account for. Dr. Pontus Skoglund, a researcher at the Francis Crick Institute who worked on the original study, published a follow-up paper in 2022 focusing specifically on pigmentation genes in ancient European populations. His research confirmed what the British data showed. Hair and eye color genes moved through Europe in waves, carried by populations that left minimal archaeological evidence beyond their DNA. He described it as a migration invisible to everything except genetics. One of the most striking examples comes from the Orkney Islands, a remote archipelago off the northern coast of Scotland. Bronze Age remains from Orkney show an unusually high frequency of red hair genes, far higher than any modern population in Europe. The islands were isolated, accessible only by sea, with limited evidence of trade or contact with mainland Britain during that period. Yet the genetic data shows that people living there 4,000 years ago had red hair at rates comparable to populations from Central Asia. Archaeologists have found no evidence of Central Asian culture in Orkney. No artifacts, no architectural styles, no burial practices that match, but the genes are there. documented in multiple individuals across different burial sites, all dated to the same narrow window in the early Bronze Age. Something happened. People arrived, and then the archaeological record goes silent, as if they were never there. The University of Edinburgh attempted to organize an expedition in 2020 to conduct more extensive DNA sampling across Bronze Age sites in Scotland, specifically targeting areas with unusual hair color gene distribution. The goal was to map genetic flow across the region and identify possible migration routes that archaeological evidence had missed. The project was approved, funded, and scheduled. Then, 3 weeks before the fieldwork was set to begin, the permit was revoked. The official reason was concerns about disturbing protected heritage sites. The same sites had been excavated multiple times in previous decades without issue. Dr. Eppie Jones, the lead researcher on the project, filed an appeal. It was denied. She requested clarification on what specific concerns had been raised. The response was that further risk assessment was required. That assessment has been pending for 3 years. The expedition never happened. What makes this frustrating is that the technology exists to answer these questions definitively. Ancient DNA sequencing can now identify not just where genes came from, but how they moved, how quickly, and through which populations. It can map migration routes with precision that archaeology alone never could, but the research is limited by access. Skeletal remains are controlled by museums and government bodies. Permits are required, and increasingly, those permits are being delayed or denied for reasons that have nothing to do with science. There's a pattern here. Initial findings are published. They show something unexpected. Follow-up research is proposed. Permission is denied or delayed indefinitely. The data doesn't disappear, but it stops moving forward. It sits in archives, in storage facilities, in databases that require institutional access to view. The public narrative remains unchanged. The genetic evidence remains buried. Dr. Barnes, the lead researcher from the Francis Crick Institute, was asked in a 2023 interview whether he believed the hair color findings would ever be fully explored. His answer was carefully worded. There's a lot we still don't understand about Bronze Age Britain. The genetic data raises questions that will require interdisciplinary collaboration to answer. Whether that collaboration happens depends on more than just scientific interest. Translation: the data is there. The questions are real, but something is preventing them from being investigated. Let's talk about what this actually means. If hair-colored genes in ancient Britain came from populations that official history doesn't acknowledge, then one of two things is true. Either those populations existed and left no trace beyond DNA, which suggests our archaeological methods are fundamentally incomplete, or the genes spread through networks of contact and intermarriage so extensive that Bronze Age Europe was far more connected than we've believed. Both possibilities rewrite what we know about ancient migration. Both suggest that the people who built Stonehenge, who settled the Orkney Islands, who farmed the British countryside 4,000 years ago, were far more diverse, far more mobile, and far more interconnected than textbooks describe. And both possibilities are being actively resisted by institutions that control access to the evidence. And the genetic data from ancient Britain isn't going away. It's been replicated in multiple studies, across multiple populations, using different sequencing methods. The findings are consistent. Hair color genes trace back to populations that shouldn't have been in Britain during the Bronze Age. The molecular clock confirms it. The geographic distribution supports it. The only thing missing is an explanation that fits the official timeline. And because that explanation doesn't exist, the research has stalled. Dr. Reich, the Harvard geneticist, put it bluntly in his 2018 paper. Ancient DNA has revealed that our models of human migration are often wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. Populations moved in ways we didn't predict, mixed in ways we didn't expect, and left genetic signatures that contradict what we thought we knew. The British hair color data is one of those signatures. It's a genetic record of people who were never supposed to be there, doing things they weren't supposed to be capable of, at a time when official history says they didn't exist. And the more researchers look, the more those signatures appear, not just in Britain, across Europe, across Asia. Everywhere ancient DNA is being tested, the same pattern emerges. The genes tell one story, the archaeology tells another, and someone has decided which story gets to be told. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a like if this data stayed with you. Tell us in the comments what you think happened. Where did those hair-colored genes really come from? And why is the research being blocked? Subscribe if you want us to keep exploring the evidence they'd rather leave buried. Because the DNA doesn't care what the official story is. It only cares what's true.